Cello strings don't cut skin the way broken glass does. Cleo Ashton learned that distinction at 11:52 p.m. on a Wednesday, crouching behind an overturned grand piano while the Meridian Theatre's antique chandelier rained crystal onto the Carrara marble below. But 20 minutes earlier, her only concern had been keeping her bow arm loose enough not to tense through the Elgar. The Meridian had stood on King Street West for nearly a century, its gilded molding and blood-red curtains preserved by a historical trust that cared more about aesthetics than the people who actually used the space. Tonight, however, the theatre had been rented out to a political fundraising foundation, which was a polite way of saying it had been rented out to everyone in the city with enough money to launder their reputations at $5,000 a plate. Cleo had played a dozen of these events. She knew the type: politicians shaking hands with developers, judges laughing at jokes made by men who kept private security on retainer, the invisible economy of a city that smiled with one half of its face while the other half arranged things in the dark. She was part of the furniture. She and the 4 other musicians, a string quartet hired through the agency that paid her $480 for a 4-hour shift, were stationed near the wine service station, providing the auditory equivalent of wallpaper. No one looked at them. No one was meant to. Cleo had positioned herself slightly angled, the way she always did at these events, so she could watch the room while appearing to read her music stand. It was a habit she'd picked up in 2 years of freelance gigging, the understanding that powerful rooms were also dangerous rooms, and situational awareness was the only security she had. She needed this shift. She needed every shift she could get. Her younger sister, Danny, was 23 years old and made bad decisions the way some people breathed, automatically, without reflection. 6 weeks ago, Danny had borrowed $40. Susanoo, from a private lending operation called Helix Capital Group, a name that appeared in Ontario corporate filings as an asset management company, though anyone who looked past the first layer of incorporation documents knew it was a financial arm of the Crow Syndicate. Danny had put the money into a friend's restaurant venture. The restaurant had folded in 3 weeks. The loan deadline had passed, and 2 days ago, a man in a dark wool coat had knocked on Cleo's apartment door on Dundas Street West and told her, without raising his voice, that Danny Ashton's situation had become a matter of personal interest to Mr. Crow. Cleo had spent 48 hours trying to find a solution. She'd called her former financial advisor. She'd gone to 3 banks. She'd nearly pawned her cello, the one thing she owned worth anything, a 1962 German workshop instrument she'd sacrificed a year of savings to acquire. She had $6,200 in her account and nowhere near enough time. And then the agency had texted her about this gig. She'd looked at the guest list, because she always looked at the guest list, and seen his name: Auden Crow. She had read about him in 3 separate investigative journalism pieces, all of which had stopped publishing after their 2nd installment. He was 40 years old, the head of a financial syndicate operating primarily in real estate, construction, and private credit. No criminal record, 2 degrees from schools that didn't need to advertise themselves. He sat on the board of a children's literacy foundation and donated to the Stratford Festival every year. He was, by every public account, a legitimate businessman. By every private account, the kind whispered in the back rooms of law offices and settlement conferences. He was the man who might soon make Danny disappear. Cleo didn't have a plan exactly. What she had was the recognition that Auden Crow would be in the same building as her for 4 hours, that she was invisible in ways most people in this room were not, and that his right-hand CFO, Morton Grail, was not going to give her a second meeting after the first one had ended with him telling her that Danny's options were diminishing. She had to go higher. It was somewhere around 10:30, during a Satie piece that required no real concentration, that she made the decision. Not impulsively, she turned it over for 40 minutes, examining it the way she used to examine balance sheets before she left her business degree behind. The risk calculation was bleak. The alternative was worse. She set down her bow. She told the quartet's leader, quietly, that she needed a moment. She smoothed her black performance dress, squared her shoulders, and walked across the ballroom floor. Auden Crow occupied a corner of the room that was less a VIP section than a gravitational field. 3 men stood within proximity of him. Not cocktail party close, but close enough to function. He was speaking to no one. He held a glass of something amber, and he watched the room with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning how to look without being seen doing it. He was taller than she'd expected, and younger looking in person, though she suspected that was deceptive. Some men wore authority the way it shaved years off a face. She was 6 feet away when the nearest man stepped forward. Not grabbing her, not yet, just a repositioning of the body, a wall made of shoulders and intent. "Ma'am," he said. "I need a moment with Mr. Crow," Cleo said. "The gentleman is not. Tell him it's about the Helix Capital exposure in the Alderworth portfolio." She kept her voice low and steady, though her heart was trying to break her sternum from the inside. "Morton Grail's Alderworth portfolio. Tell him it's a musician who figures things out by ear." She wasn't entirely sure why she said that last part. Nerves, maybe, or some stubborn instinct to be honest about what she was. The guard studied her for a long moment, then stepped back and murmured something low. Auden Crow turned. His gaze found her with an efficiency that suggested he'd already clocked her before she'd even crossed the floor. He came to her himself. That surprised her. She'd expected to be brought to him. Instead, he walked to stand a few feet away, taking her measure with the same careful attention he'd directed at the room. Up close, his face was harder, a jaw that looked like a decision rather than an accident, but his eyes were something she hadn't anticipated. Not cold. Sharp in a way that implied actual listening. "You play the cello," he said, not a question. "I do." She held his gaze. "I also spent 2 years studying chartered accountancy before I changed programs. I've spent 6 weeks going through every public filing associated with Helix Capital Group. I found something in the Alderworth structure that I don't believe you know about." A pause, the kind of silence that precedes a calculation. "My sister is Danny Ashton," Cleo said. "She owes you $40,000. I'm here to propose an arrangement." He studied her for another moment, then, "Follow me." She did. Through a side corridor, through a door propped open by a felt wedge, into a green room off the main hall, low-lit, smelling of old velvet and wood polish. 2 of his men took up positions outside. 5 minutes, Auden said. "Talk." Cleo talked. She explained what she'd found, precisely, the way she'd rehearsed it during every sleepless night over the past 2 weeks. The Alderworth portfolio was a real estate holding structure. On paper, it was clean. But there was a pattern in the quarterly distribution transfers, small discrepancies, each one within rounding error on its own, but compounding in a direction that no legitimate accounting error would compound. The money was being extracted, slowly, deliberately. Whoever was doing it understood the structure well enough to stay within the margins of what an auditor would flag as noise. "Over the past 18 months, Cleo said, "you've lost approximately $2.3 million to whoever is managing those transfers." Auden's expression didn't change. "And you determined this how?" "I asked for Helix's public filing 6 weeks ago, trying to find a legal argument for my sister's case. I have a good memory for numbers. I noticed the pattern because it has the same shape as harmonic drift, when an instrument goes slowly out of tune in a way the player can't hear anymore because they've adjusted their ear to the deviation. It stays below the threshold of what triggers attention. But it's there." She paused. "I have a hypothesis about who's responsible. I'd need access to the internal transfer records to confirm it." Before Auden could respond, the service door opened. Not the guards, but a different entrance, and a member of the catering staff stepped inside to announce the program was resuming. Cleo noted, with the automatic attention of someone who had watched service staff her entire working life, that the man's shoes were wrong. Black dress shoes, yes, but the soles were rubber tactical, the kind you wore when you expected to need grip and lateral support. It registered before she could articulate why it mattered. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. "Down," Cleo said. And then, before she'd consciously decided anything, she shoved Auden Crow sideways into the wall with everything she had. The suppressed shot tore through the air where his chest had been. It hit the mirror behind him. Glass sprayed outward in a burst of silver shards and scattered light. Then the guards came through both doors at once, and the anteroom became chaos. She didn't remember the next 90 seconds in any coherent order. There was the crack of a firearm twice. There was the sensation of Auden's arm coming around her and pulling her to the floor behind an overturned settee. There was the smell of discharged ammunition mixed with old upholstery. There was the moment when she understood, distantly, and with the strange calm of total sensory overload, that she was not going to die in the next 30 seconds. Probably. "Can you run?" Auden's voice very close to her ear. His hand was at her elbow. Yes. Then run. They went through a service door, down a stairwell, into the loading corridor that ran beneath the south side of the building. Cleo had used it on previous gigs. It was the fastest route to the street for equipment loadout. She said so, and Auden didn't question her. They came out on a side street. A black SUV was idling at the curb. Some wordless exchange happened between Auden and one of the men who had followed them down, and they were moving within 90 seconds. The drive was quiet. Cleo's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed the way her old chamber music coach had taught her. Long exhales, steady tempo, until the shaking subsided into something manageable. "That was Morton's man," Auden said eventually. "I think so." Cleo kept her eyes on the city strobing past the window. The shooter had operational familiarity with the venue. "He knew the anteroom access, which means he knew where you'd be. Morton arranged the venue walkthrough last week. It was in the event program your foundation submitted to the theatre board. I read it when I was researching who to approach about Danny's debt." Auden looked at her across the dark interior. "You read the event program," he said. "I read everything I could find," Cleo said. "I was trying to save my sister's life." They went to an apartment on the 34th floor of a glass tower in the financial district, registered, according to the building directory, to a numbered corporation. It looked like no one lived there. Expensive, stripped down, functional. The kind of space that existed not as a home but as a contingency. Auden's remaining men arrived in intervals over the next half hour. Morton Grail arrived last, looking flushed and performing distress with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it. "Thank God," Morton said, rushing forward. "I got the call. It has to be the Sullivans. They've been watching for an opening for months. We need to." "Show him," Auden said to Cleo. She had been given a laptop. She'd spent the previous 40 minutes going through the internal transfer records that Auden's access credentials had unlocked. What she'd suspected from the public filings was confirmed in the private ones, and considerably worse. She turned the screen toward Morton and walked him through it, column by column, transfer by transfer, the way she would have presented an audit finding to a senior partner in another life. Morton's face changed as she spoke. The performed distress dissolved, and what was underneath it was uglier and much more honest. "She's lying," he said. "She's a musician. She doesn't understand what she's looking at." "The Beaumont Trust account in the Caymans," Cleo continued steadily, "was opened 14 months ago. The primary beneficiary is a numbered Ontario corporation whose registered agent is your brother-in-law. The first transfer occurred the same week you restructured the Alderworth distribution schedule." She turned the screen slightly. "The timing isn't a coincidence. The amounts aren't rounding errors. And the Sullivans had nothing to do with tonight, because the man in the anteroom was wearing a communications earpiece running on an encrypted frequency, matching the device specification your office ordered from a Quebec supplier 8 months ago." She paused. "I found the purchase invoice in the Foundation's equipment records. I read those too." Morton moved. Not toward her, toward the door. He didn't reach it. Cleo turned back to the window. She watched the grid of city lights below, patient and indifferent, and she kept her breathing steady, and her hands still, and her face composed until the room was quiet again. When she turned back, Auden was standing near the window, not close, a considered distance. "Your sister's debt," he said, "is cancelled." Cleo nodded. Her voice when she found it was smaller than she would have liked. "Thank you." "I'm not finished." He set his glass down on the windowsill and looked at her with the same measuring attention he'd used in the ballroom, except something in it was different now, less guarded, more direct. Morton ran the financial architecture of this organization for 11 years. He knew every structure, every routing, every exposure. "I need someone who can find what he buried and close what he opened. Someone who reads the things other people don't think to read." A pause. "Someone who walks into a room full of dangerous people and does not lose her footing." "I'm a cellist," Cleo said. "You're also a forensic accountant who doesn't know she is one yet." Something shifted fractionally at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not asking you to give up the cello. I'm asking you to stop pretending the other half isn't real." She looked at him. She looked at the city. She thought about $480 shifts and Danny's face when the man in the wool coat had come to the door, and the feeling of crouching behind the overturned settee while glass fell, and how, in the middle of all of that, some part of her had felt not safe, nothing remotely like that, but fully awake in a way that 4-hour catering gigs had never once managed. "You'll pay me a proper rate," she said, "and Danny gets a clean record with your organization, documented, through someone whose credentials I can independently verify." Done. Cleo Ashton, who had come to the Meridian Theatre that night to play Elgar for people who would never learn her name, reached across the distance between them and shook the hand of the most dangerous employer she had ever considered taking. His grip was firm and brief, and treated her, she noticed, exactly like a professional. That was either the beginning of something extraordinary or the most elegant trap she had ever walked into. She had survived tonight by trusting her own ear. She decided to trust it one more time. Did Cleo Ashton just claim her throne or sign away her freedom? Drop a like if you think she made the right call, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the most powerful man in the city discovers exactly how much his new partner is worth. Share this one with someone who knows that the most dangerous thing in any room isn't always the one with a gun.